Okay, we are all set up on TikTok, and we're live here on Twitch also. Very good. Oh, I got a couple of people joining in here live on TikTok. Very good. Hello, Nature Calls. Just to let you guys know, I'm lecturing on Twitch. Um, you can watch me here, of course, but I'm mostly going to be looking at the camera for Twitch. And you're also missing out on the PowerPoint presentation that's going to go with today's lecture, which is on the 1918 influenza pandemic, which you have heard called the Spanish flu. One of the things we're going to talk about is why it makes no sense to call it the Spanish flu, but the historical reasons that it was called that and that we still call it that now. But you may want to hop over to Twitch if that's something you're interested in to get the full experience. We're going to get started in just a few minutes here. Make sure I'm all set up on that end. Oh, I see one person here in the Twitch chat already. Very good. Nice to have you. Thank you for being here. Thank you guys for being here on TikTok as well. Glad to have you both. Hello, Sweet Tail for You. So glad you could join us today. I'm very happy to see you. I'm happy to see everybody. I'm glad that we've got some viewers today. I think today's going to be an interesting lecture. I think you're going to enjoy it. Of course, I say that every time, and I'm biased. So that is what it is. Hello, Tim Elliott. Thank you for being here. Hello, Zaresi. Is that X pronounced that way? Zaresi. Thank you for being here. I sure appreciate it. We got a good little crowd setting up between TikTok and Twitch here. Happy to be here. I am so glad. I am really, like I said, I'm glad to have you. Today should be good. We're going to give everybody at least a few minutes to get in, get settled. Of course, we're officially not starting till 3, but we'll give it a few minutes even past that probably. Favorite flavor of crayon? You know, I don't eat too many of them. They're not too good for the system there. Hello, Sarah. Thank you for stopping in. Nice to see you. It's good to have some people stop in. For those who have just popped in, we're doing a lecture today on the 1918 influenza pandemic, also called the Spanish flu. One of the things we're going to talk about is why it doesn't make sense to call it the Spanish flu. But you may want to hop over to Twitch. That way you'll get the PowerPoint and the full experience. But it's great for you to be here too. I'll try to look down here and take questions as I go along. This applies to both TikTok and Twitch. If you want to ask questions as we go, great. If you want to save them for the end, there will be time at the end. Either way, just like a regular class, basically. What do you do on live? I'm giving a lecture, kind of like you would do for a class. That's something I am going to try to be doing regularly every Sunday at 3 p.m. Central Time. I could actually switch to the camera here now. I don't know. I haven't done that yet, Twitch viewers. But yeah, I'm going... DD Spanish flu. I don't know what song reference that is. I'm missing it somehow. Hard when you can't hear it and you're just reading it. Hello from Ireland. Well, hello. Very glad to see you. It's a little bit later at night over on that side of the pond from here in Texas. So glad that you're here with me this evening. It is 3 o'clock now, but like I said, I like to give people a couple of minutes still to shuffle in before we officially get started. Hello, blue-haired girl. Thank you for being here. But yeah, so the 1918 flu, one of the things that's sort of interesting, and so one of the reasons that we're going to talk about it today is because it used to be something that you wouldn't really get, it wouldn't be talked about much in a history class or in history books or what have you. And there's a couple of reasons for that, and we're going to talk about that throughout the lecture. But it's now fairly important to talk about it because of all the parallels that you can draw to the COVID-19 pandemic. There's a lot of differences too, but there's a lot of similarities. Hello from Illinois. Great. Glad you're here. Um, hello, dat boy. Great. Um, and let me make sure I actually should put on the Discord chat that I am live. I have not done that. Get that set up. Oh, dang it. All right, there we go. That's set up now. And, all right, like I said, we got a handful of viewers here in the Twitch chat as well. This should be a good little crowd we get going. Again, feel free to ask questions. I won't look at the TikTok chat quite as often as I will the Twitch chat, but I will try to check in with you guys if you have questions. Hello from Idaho. Thank you for tuning in. I say tuning in as if this was, TV or radio or something, but it's interesting the way language works, right? That we still sort of use phrases like that, to tune in or to dial something when haven't had to turn a dial on things like that in a long time. But that's neither here nor there. All right, I think we can go ahead and sort of get to the beginnings of the lecture proper. And let me actually get the slideshow window correct. There we go. All right. So, like I said, today we're going to talk about the 1918 influenza pandemic, which is called the Spanish flu most popularly, and this is an exploration of the forgotten pandemic. Like I was saying, this is something that people didn't really spend very much time talking about. It usually kind of got lumped in with the overall narrative of World War I. But there's a lot going on culturally that happens because of this pandemic that we really should take some time to think about. And you're going to see a lot of parallels to modern society that I think you're going to find pretty interesting. But first things first, why do we call this the Spanish flu? Because it does not originate in Spain. The flu doesn't start in Spain. But most countries at this time are at war, right, in the Great War, World War I, and they're engaged in censorship of the press to preserve morale mostly, right? Censorship of war-related things and also of flu-related things. But Spain is neutral in World War I, and so they did not really censor the really devastating effects of this flu. And especially frightening are the reports that begin that their king, King Alfonso, had contracted this virus, which he did, and he got pretty sick. And so as these reports spread around the world, everyone starts calling it, well, not everyone, we'll get to that. The British, the Americans, the French, and some others start calling this the Spanish flu because of how devastating it seems in their press coverage. It's important to note that King Alfonso was not the only leader that comes down with the flu. U.S. President Woodrow Wilson will contract the flu while he's actually negotiating peace deals for World War I. Just before he presents the 14 points, he contracts the flu. So, like I said, it appeared to some that the Spanish were far worse off than others, but this was not the case. And there's also an element here of Hispanophobia, especially in the United States and to some degree in Britain. There's this long history of the Black Legend, right, that dates back into the 16th, 17th centuries of the cruelty of the Spanish Inquisition, the way they treated Native Americans, etc. So there's a long-standing Hispanophobia in the U.S. and Britain. And the United States in particular sees Spain as an enemy at this time because of they are sort of not separate church and state the way Americans think they are. Of course, they aren't. But the Catholicism and the monarchy and the way that the Spanish state is run, they see as the antithesis to American values. And of course, the Spanish-American War is not that far behind these events. That was 1898. And the Mexican Revolution runs from 1910 to 1920, and those events also feed into the Hispanophobia that exists at this time. They sort of want to blame the virus on the Spanish, which, if that sounds familiar in the present day, you can recall, the China virus and phrases like that from the previous U.S. administration that did a very similar thing. But let's talk about what other people called the flu, because I think this is really fascinating. So the French, the British, and the Americans will say the Spanish flu or the Spanish lady. In Spain, they have two names for this flu. First, they call it the French flu because they believe French people brought it to Spain. And not the first president to get the virus during a global outbreak, it says on TikTok. Yes, that's true. So Spain calls it the French flu, but they will also call it the Naples Soldier, which was the name of a popular operetta, a popular musical comedy at the time. And the guy who wrote the book for that operetta said that the music was as catchy as the flu. And so they start calling the flu the Naples Soldier marching through Spain. And I think that's both morbid but also kind of funny. In Japan, they will call it the sumo flu. Some people in the press will, because they first have it break out at a wrestling match. In Persia, it's the British flu. In Senegal, it's the Brazilian flu. In Brazil, it's the German flu. In Germany, it's the Russian pest. In Poland, it's the Bolshevik disease. Similar things there. In Russia, it's the Chinese flu. And I also love that in Denmark, they just say it comes from the south. So they don't know which country caused it. They just know it wasn't Norway or Sweden. Hello, Mr. Bear. Thank you so much for being here. No worries about being late. We were just talking here about the various names of what the Spanish flu has been called by others in history. Which is, like I said, that's a pretty fascinating, I think. So I generally just try to call it the 1918 flu, the 1918 influenza pandemic, things along these lines, although it lasts longer than just 1918, which we will talk about. But to call it the Spanish flu doesn't make sense, as we see historically on multiple levels. But let's talk a little bit about what this flu actually was and sort of the backgrounds, the basics. So this was an H1N1A virus, which was also responsible for a 1977 flu in Russia and the 2009 swine flu outbreak, were both H1N1A influenza. Now, this was a mild seasonal flu when it started in the spring of 1918. They first start noticing it sometime around January. And really March of 1918 is when it really starts to pick up. But it doesn't seem like it's going to be that bad. Maybe a little worse than a normal seasonal flu. But then it gets really scary in the fall of 1918. It starts to really take hold. Yes, I'm in Twitch, not a Zoom meeting, not teaching. I am sort of teaching a class. I'm teaching a class to all of you guys. So, the way it worked, the way this flu killed people, was that people usually died from what's called a super infection, which is when you get a second infection on top of the first, and that is usually even less resistant to treatment. In this case, it was pneumonia, sometimes sepsis, sometimes a septic infection, and sometimes this would kill people literally within hours, overnight. Usually it took a number of days, perhaps a week. But either way, it became a really, really scary virus, a really scary illness. And just like with COVID-19, there are lingering symptoms for those who survive, especially what they called psychoses of influenza or post-influenzal manifestations. Today in the press for COVID-19, you hear it called brain fog. Right, that happens while people are sick and sometimes for a long time after, where your ability to think is hindered. And this happened to President Woodrow Wilson. They say that even after he'd recovered from most of the symptoms of the flu, that he was paranoid, that he became obsessed with furniture for some reason, which I think is really weird. So the flu this flu very much affected the brain in some very bizarre ways. Um, so there are 4 waves of this virus. The fall of 1918 is by far the deadliest, but there are also 2 waves in 1919 that are nothing to to ignore, but they were not nearly as deadly. Um, Now, it's important to note that as deadly as this flu itself was, the number of deaths was inflated beyond just what the flu caused, because these deaths could be caused by poor hygiene and malnourishment and those kinds of things in these, huge, makeshift hospitals that they were having to treat people in, and that's often what could cause these super infections, right? Deaths were also caused by aspirin poisoning. Because that was one of the only things they had to treat it. And we'll talk a little more about that too. But one of the symptoms of aspirin poisoning is pulmonary edema, fluid in the lungs, just like pneumonia. So it was really sort of terrible that even the treatment could often cause your death just as much as the flu itself could. So a little more about the infectivity and the fatality. Ultimately, this strain of the flu will infect up to a third of the entire world's population, about 500 million people, and it killed as many as 50 million people. Some estimates I've seen will inflate that even as high as 100, and maybe that's possible, but around 50 million is a fairly standard number you see most experts agree on. Just came over from TikTok, need my dose of history. Great, thank you so much for coming over. I really appreciate it. Good evening from the UK. Great, fantastic, thank you. Pneumonia was caused by an organism that bears the name of the flu, Haemophilus influenzae. Interesting. All right. See, I don't know all the science stuff as well as I could. That part's a little out of my comfort zone. So, part of the reason that this strain of the flu was so deadly and so infective was something called a W curve that made it deadly not only to infants and the elderly, but even to healthy adults. And it triggered what they call a cytokine storm. Now, I'm not going to try to explain the science medicine part of that because I don't understand it. But what it did was it caused an overactive immune system, an overactive immune response in healthy people. And again, from what I have read, COVID-19 SARS-CoV-2 does the exact same thing. It triggers this cytokine storm. And so that makes it really especially deadly compared to other strains of the flu. Good evening from Maine. Fantastic. Thank you for being here. And bye-bye to the person waving at me. But this becomes so deadly that more American soldiers will fall to the flu than will fall in battle in World War I. So I want to make it clear just how important, just how big a part of everything going on this flu really was. And there's a perfect storm to make this flu absolutely terrible and to cause as many deaths as it did, like we talked about. So there's overcrowding, right, in the medical facilities, in the hospitals and the clinics, but also these makeshift camps they're having to build, and of course military hospital camps, right? There's so many people sick, plus all of the wounded and other people who just had other things that needed treating, that the medical systems are overwhelmed. There's a shortage of doctors and nurses, again, because there's so many people to be treated, but also because the doctors and nurses themselves will come down with the flu. On the front lines, good evening from Newburgh, Indiana. Fantastic. On the front lines, of course, they're in close quarters, and the trench warfare, you may already know, caused all kinds of terrible infections, trench foot, and what have you. So that certainly led to the spread of the virus much faster than it might have spread otherwise. All of these soldiers in close quarters and then returning home in large amounts, right? Poor hygiene, that sort of stands on its own. No additional explanation need there. There is no vaccine and there are no antibiotics to treat this. The first antibiotics are not available until the 1930s. The first flu vaccine is not available until the 1940s. So we're a long way off. Thank you, Ms. DeBear, for that reminder. We're a long way off from the kinds of things that can actually treat the flu in any significant way. Thank you for the gifts, Taylor. Thank you very much, and good morning or good evening from Idaho, Ohio. Excuse me. Spanish flu. Yes, we're talking about Spanish flu. If you want to hop over to Twitch, we've got a PowerPoint going as well. Um, and the other thing, like we talked about, is aspirin poisoning. Now, the symptoms of aspirin poisoning, among them are fever, dehydration, nausea, and again, pulmonary edema, fluid in the lungs, which is just like the flu and pneumonia. So it was this terrible thing, right? Even if they were trying to treat you with aspirin, you could just as much die the same way through being treated by aspirin as you could be by the flu. And my understanding is I don't think they fully understood that aspirin poisoning was happening. I think they thought it was people dying from the flu rather than the aspirin at that time. I could be wrong about that, but I think that's correct. So let's talk a little about how they tried to combat this virus. It's a lot the same like you have seen with COVID-19. They engaged in social distancing and quarantining. People quarantined in their homes. They wore masks. They made efforts at public sanitization, hand washing efforts, that kind of thing. And I love this picture here in the PowerPoint that these whole families are wearing masks, and they even have masks on their cats. So that's how seriously most people took it. They closed public places. They closed theaters, or in some cases, they would at least, like in New York City, they tried to stagger opening and closing of businesses so that fewer people were out at a time. But like a lot of libraries will put a halt on lending books, things like that. They will try to minimize public contact. Thank you, Taylor. Really appreciate it. They will engage in palliative care, treating symptoms. Aspirin, like we said, but Epsom salts, castor oil, things that will treat inflammation and sort of ease the discomfort of the symptoms, because that's all they can do. And actually, I should have put the bottom bullet point up here next. There's this commercialism in medicine too, and in particular, Vicks VapoRub really gets in on this. They tell people if you feel even a little bit of a symptom of a cold, you should run out and buy some Vicks VapoRub and rub it on your chest and alleviate those symptoms, and hopefully keep yourself from getting any sicker. So I thought that was really interesting, the sort of commercial medicine aspect of this. And then there's also, public health information campaigns. In the city of Philadelphia, there are signs everywhere in big, bold capital letters that say, "Spit spreads death." And so that's, people, I don't know if you know this, but people used to spit a lot more than they do now. They spit everywhere all the time in the street. And people needed to spit more, in part due to chewing tobacco, but also there were a lot of things that could cause your lungs to be congested, especially if you lived anywhere, mining or, industrial with lots of smog, things like that. So people were spitting a lot, and that certainly helped to spread the disease. The Boy Scouts of New York would actually hand out little cards that when they saw someone spitting that said, "You are in violation of the sanitary code." The Boy Scouts were trying to do their best. Mr. Bear, you say you hate this information. I assume you mean the spitting information. Yeah, it's not pleasant. I mean, there were no public places usually that didn't have a spittoon to spit in. But, public streets in general were very gross, bad places, even up at this time in 1918. You had... most people were, on horses, or not most people, but I mean, lots of people were on horses. They had animals in the streets, pigs, things like that. Public streets were generally pretty gross. Not a place you really wanted to spend a lot of time. And of course, you're packed in like sardines in some of those big cities, like New York, Philadelphia, Boston. They were vectors for disease in many, many ways. And so it was difficult to combat it. Again, just like today, and this is something that I find really interesting, is that there was a lot of misinformation and conspiracy theories regarding the Spanish flu. Someone asked here on TikTok, 1 to 10, how cool/crazy is it that we found a vaccine in only a year for COVID? It's extremely amazing that we were able to develop a vaccine that quickly. The whole world essentially threw their weight behind it, the whole scientific, medical community. And it's pretty astounding. So, as far as misinformation and conspiracies goes, There was wartime censorship, like we talked about. The countries are trying to keep morale up, and it's this sense of paternalism, right? That the government is trying to take care of their people by keeping them from panicking. It wasn't necessarily malicious intent. It really was an attempt to keep the countries going, keep calm and carry on, like we see, later in World War II in the UK. Is that your real voice? Are you naturally a news presenter? I mean, I put a little bit of a voice on, but it also is kind of just my voice in a way. At any rate, there's also a misunderstanding of diseases and how they operate, even with germ theory. Most people understand the idea of germs at this point, but people still don't understand how germs can spread completely. And so they think germs can be spread through all kinds of different ways that they actually can't, including Bayer aspirin. Now, there's teutophobia, Germanophobia at this time, obviously because of World War I, most importantly. And people believe in America that the Germans are using Bayer aspirin to spread the disease, that they're poisoning Bayer aspirin, even though Bayer is being made, like we see in this advertisement, in New Jersey, in other parts of the US, in other parts of the world, because the patent on aspirin had actually expired, I think in 1917, so anyone could make it. But still, Americans believed that Bayer aspirin was poisoned. And it's in part because of that aspirin poisoning, right? They saw people getting sicker or more sick or not being cured when they were treated with aspirin, and, well, it must have been the Germans. And U-boats. They thought U-boats were able to spread poison gases somehow as they traveled, which that one seems kind of wild. I can almost get the aspirin one. The U-boats one, I can't quite understand how they thought submarines were, spreading poison gases to the rest of the world. But that was something that people thought. And it was difficult to combat this misinformation. Now, you didn't have Twitter to spread it quite as quickly, but news still spread pretty fast even at this time, especially that kind of, yellow journalism, as you hear it called. Didn't seem to hinder their progress. Bayer still exists today. Yes, absolutely. And they're still, aspirin, I'm sure, must still be their #1 product. But that's a reason, the word aspirin, the name aspirin, was actually like a trademark for what is acetyl salicylic acid, right? And then it became a genericized trademark is the term for it. So, again, just like today, there's a backlash to this these public health orders across the country. You see them the most in California and in Oregon and that area, in part because they impose some of the harshest penalties. And in San Francisco, they will impose steep fines. $5, I think, was the standard, first offense fine, but they would even imprison you. The mayor of Oakland, California, was actually thrown in jail for refusing to wear his mask. So they really took it extremely seriously in San Francisco. And as you can see in this newspaper article here, it actually came to gunfights sometimes, 3 shot in struggle with mask slacker. A health inspector tries to force this blacksmith to wear a mask, and a gunfight ensues in which several people are harmed. And citizens of San Francisco will also organize an anti-mask league that will meet at a skating rink, interestingly, of all places. And this is attended by thousands. I mean, it's not any small thing. Now, I don't know that anywhere else in the country managed to gather a group of anti-maskers that large. They could have, and I just haven't come across it. But I think that is by far the largest one. Now, it's also important to note that there was a little more debate in the medical community over the masks than there has been today. When the American Medical Association has their annual conference in 1918, there's a little bit of a split, but the majority of doctors still agree that masks are the way to go, even at that time. But there's a little more concern, in part because they simply didn't have the knowledge that we now have. And by far, the public mostly embraces mask wearing, as we saw in those photographs earlier. So I want to look at a case study of just how severe this virus could be. And this is a famous one you may or may not have heard of, in news articles and things like that, of an event that happened in Philadelphia. So they hold a parade in Philadelphia on September 28, 1918, for Liberty loans, for loans to finance the war, right? Which of course is soon coming to an end anyway. But they have this huge parade, and the doctors of Philadelphia, yes, super spreader event. That's exactly what this was. The doctors, in particular, the main sort of doctor in charge of public health in Philadelphia, will strongly recommend against holding this event, but they wanted to hold it, and hold it, so they did. And again, at least 200,000 people attend this parade, and you can see how tightly they're packed in, right? I mean, there is no social distancing. I can't tell, because it's not quite high enough resolution. I can't tell if anyone is wearing the masks or not. I think there are a handful of people wearing masks there, but I can see a lot of people who aren't. Not that it would matter that much anyway, with people literally shoulder to shoulder. Did a thesis on the 18 flu epidemic. Very cool. So I may not be telling you anything that you don't know. You may not be learning very much new in this particular case. But I'm glad you stopped in. How long did they continue the original influenza pandemic? In 1920 last, did they continue to wear masks years on? That's a great question. I would think they stopped wearing them at very least in early 1920, if not earlier, because of course there were 4 waves, like I said, of the 1918 flu. It actually continued through 1919, and I believe that people mostly continued to wear masks through then. But surely by 1920 they had mostly stopped wearing masks. But that's an educated guess. I don't know that for a fact from my sources or anything. So this super spreader event, this Liberty Loans Parade, will cause the flu to spread rapidly. The hospitals of Philadelphia will be full within a week, as will any other medical facility, that there is. I was more from the public health side. The politics is all new. Great. I'm glad I was able to contribute something new to your knowledge. That's always what I'm looking to do. Thanks for answering your question. Always happy to do so. There's not enough nurses, and nuns will step in to take their place in Philadelphia. The nurses will get sick and die en masse just like anyone else. There's not enough morticians, and bodies will begin to pile up even in people's homes. They actually, for a while, they try to just bury people directly, planting, they call it, where they don't, have a coffin or anything else. But even that's not enough, and the bodies literally begin to pile up in Philadelphia. Of the 200,000 attendees, there are 50,000 cases and 12,000 will die, roughly are the numbers. And I can't help but imagine surely it continued to spread, in a larger capacity long beyond that. But the initial sort of super spreader event led to, many, many thousands of people dying that probably would not have otherwise. I have read that St. Louis is sort of an opposite example, where they really strictly enforced quarantining and social distancing, and their numbers of deaths were extremely low. But I don't have that information in front of me. So, how, after everything that we've talked about now, could this be a forgotten pandemic, as it's sometimes been called, right? Why is this something that up until COVID-19 we didn't really talk about very much? Well, there's a lot of reasons for that. One of them is the rapid pace at which it happened. It began and was over relatively quickly, the deadliest wave. And dead men tell no tales, right? If people die quickly from the flu, they're not around to give an oral history or an interview to talk about it. And the trauma of the survivors, right? People don't want to talk about this horrific event necessarily. The trauma and the confusion of the doctors. Up at this point, there was really sort of hubris, for lack of a better word, for doctors who really thought they were understanding the spread of communicable diseases, how to control the spread, how to treat this kind of disease, how to treat the flu in particular. And this absolutely knocks the doctors of the world on their asses. St. Louis County is the only part of Missouri that's really enforcing masks right now. So more historical parallels. I'm glad you told me that. In a way, there's that. Doesn't seem that having knowledge of hygiene has helped us much even 100 years later. Media is definitely keeping confusion and drama going on now more than 100 years ago. Yes and no. Again, the media was being censored in most countries specifically, so they couldn't if they'd wanted to, although they did try. Um, so, again, the doctors of the world get knocked on their asses. They don't want to talk about this because they're embarrassed that this happened. Um, there's a prevalence of disease in daily life already, right? The flu was just one of a million different things, like tuberculosis in particular, that were already a part of people's lives. They were sort of, in some ways, accustomed to terrible diseases being part of their experience. And so the flu just kind of got lumped in with those other things. The censorship and paternalism that we talked about, right? And media coverage of the war was much more prominent, of the war effort and of battles in the war, and troop movements. Well, not troop movements, but you know what I mean. That was much more prominent for, good reason, right? That was the thing that they really thought was most important, was to follow the day-by-day narrative of how the war was going. And it was ultimately seen as an extension of the war, which we still can see it as that now, right? Because this virus, in large part, was being spread by the war. It was being spread by soldiers in the trenches who came home to the United States or to Britain or to France, what have you, and then spread it at home. And there was also the first Red Scare going on at this time, right? The scare of communism and of the Russian Revolution, and those things. And that was another thing that took up a lot of oxygen in the room, right? That was major coverage. So all of these things added up meant that the 1918 flu, or the Spanish flu, as most people would have called it, at least in English-speaking countries, meant that it just wasn't being talked about, despite the fact that it really was a devastating event in so many ways. But then COVID-19 came along, and all of a sudden it became really important to talk about it. Now, again, we saw so many similarities in the political side of things, right, and in the cultural side of things, and the way sorry, I lost my train of thought there for a second. In the again, the way people reacted and the masks and all these kinds of things. But the anti-mask sentiment was much less than it is now. And on the other side of things, the flu was much more deadly, both on its own and because of all of these other conditions than COVID-19 is. So not everything is perfectly parallel. Indiana just continued the mask mandate, but all places I've been to still required it in Evansville. Yeah, the thing about it is even when government mask mandates ended, it seems that most businesses have kept those mask mandates in place. And I haven't done that part of the research for this. Like, I don't know the degree to which it was public versus private business, and who, was enforcing mask mandates and those kinds of things, and the role that private enterprise and corporations and things like that played in that part of it. So that's interesting. That's something I actually probably ought to look into for the next time I add some more stuff to this. This is actually an expanded version of a lecture that I do give for my online U.S. history class. So y'all got sort of a taste of what that looks like. Hello from Russia. Oh, very cool. And do you think we will ever go back to normal again? That's a great question for both 1918 and now, right? There were certainly things that changed culturally at that time. To talk about today, some things won't ever go back. That we've discovered this, how much that we can do virtually now. People will work from home still a lot more, even if they don't do it permanently. They will do it more often. Restaurants will probably continue having curbside service forever. There are a lot of things that we've changed about the way we go about our daily lives that will probably continue well into the future. If we want to talk about 1918 in that way, actually, let me go ahead and move on to our Q&A layout here on Twitch, since that's where we essentially are now. In 1918, right, one of the biggest things that changed pretty significantly was spitting. People started spitting a lot less. Now, that wasn't just the flu, and in particular, tuberculosis was the thing that really, I think, ended public spitting as we know it. But the flu certainly contributed. Again, I love the mental image of the Boy Scouts of New York going up to people, handing out little cards that, telling them not to spit. That's a good deed for the day, for sure. So yeah, these events absolutely change cultures, governments, things like that permanently in many ways. I love your content, very informative and compelling. Thank you. That's what I like to hear. I really appreciate that compliment. So yeah, if anyone has any specific questions or comments they'd like to make, parallels they'd like to draw, feelings that they had about this, anything you'd like to say, I'm absolutely open, and I will answer your questions to the best of my ability. There are parts that I'm not an expert on, like the medical science aspects in particular. I don't understand all the ins and outs of how viruses operate. But the cultural side of things, I think I can answer relatively easily. Mother always said spitting is the most disrespectful thing due to it spreading disease. Mother was right, but people really didn't care for a long time. Who would win in a fight, 1,000 lions or the sun? I don't even know how to begin to answer that question, except to say the sun is going to be the winner in almost any sort of thing like that, because it's the sun. But that's silly. Let's see if I've missed anything here. No, looks like I've got it. But yeah, like I said, I think it's important that we think about how similar this was. And like always, this has been mostly from a U.S. perspective, but much of this was very similar in Britain and I believe in France. I know less about a lot of the other parts of the world. Something that I left out actually was that in terms of that information, needing information and the censorship and that kind of thing, there were actually, I saw public protests in San Antonio, Texas, trying to get more information. People were upset that they weren't getting the fullest information they could, and they wanted to protect themselves. What were some other major pandemics aside from like the bubonic plague? I think of the ones in more recent history, right? Especially ones that caused cultural panics. The swine flu, again, was, an H1N1A virus, just like it was the same strain that caused the Spanish flu. I was surprised to find out that masks were worn in 1918. Yeah, no, they absolutely, there was some debate, but they pretty much had that figured out, that flu was spread by respiratory droplets. So yeah, the swine flu, of course, Ebola, if you remember, was a big deal. There's been lots of flu pandemics throughout history. That's happened many times, but very few as devastating as 1918 was. But flu has been a scourge for, hundreds, if not thousands of years. I'm not sure when it first begins. There were stories of the local public houses being set up as makeshift morgues, storing bodies in the cooler areas in the basements. Yes, that's absolutely true. Any place that could be made to store bodies did in the cities like Philadelphia that needed it. It was truly, it was really horrific. The speed at which the virus spread and killed people. And with COVID-19 in New York City, right, fairly early on, right, we saw those refrigerated trucks and concerns that bodies would begin to pile up faster than they could be handled. It ultimately, I don't know that it got quite as bad as 1918 was. If it was, it certainly wasn't for very long, but it was still absolutely a concern. And again, COVID is a separate strain of the flu, but it's amazing how many things are similar. Is that where the toe tag originated? I have to imagine that the toe tag is earlier than that or has another origin, but I don't actually know. That's a fantastic question that you can believe I will be Googling when this is done to find out more. But I would think the need of toe tags to identify bodies must predate that. COVID is not a strain of flu. Now, my understanding is SARS-CoV-2 is an influenza virus. Perhaps I have that wrong, but I don't believe that's the case. Um, but it certainly, regardless, has essentially most of the same symptoms. Um, I'm not saying that it's not much worse than a normal seasonal flu. Don't get me wrong. I'm actually looking up real quick because I don't want to spread misinformation, um, and so I want to look that. Oh yeah, okay. So I did in fact have that wrong. I don't know. Oh, they're both caused by coronaviruses. That's the flu is also a coronavirus. That's where I was getting it. I just had that slightly off. Yes, the COVID is a coronavirus, and influenza is also a coronavirus. So named because right, they've got those little things that stick off of them that make them look like a crown under a microscope. Corona crown. Um, um, how interesting do you find it that in 1918 they knew the sun was influential in helping patients? You know, I don't know too much about this, but I know that the sun and this idea of light therapy is something a colleague of mine has worked on. That light can be helpful. I think that's really interesting, but I don't know too much about it. Do I think it's crazy weird that there's been a pandemic every 100 years? I don't know if has there been one, every 100 years. I'd like to look at that and see how far back it goes. Um, but part of that has to do with just the cycle of humanity, right, and people moving around and that kind of thing. What does that mean, a different strain? So there are different viruses, slight differences, even though they're the same kind of virus, is basically what it means. I don't know too much about the actual physicality of how viruses are shaped to be able to tell you that. Do you like cheese? Yes, sure. Is this is a completely irrelevant question, but do you do these kinds of streams often? I really enjoy the information. I'm glad you did. That's what I love to hear. Yes, I'm planning to do these every single Sunday at 3 p.m. Central Time. That's my hope. I was doing it a little earlier in the year, and then I had some personal things that derailed it. But I'm back now. Um, Influenza is of the family Orthomyxoviridae. Coronavirus is Coronaviridae. I can't speak to the specific scientific terms. All I can speak to is what the basic readings from the CDC and those other scientific groups that say influenza is also a type of coronavirus. But that's not my area, so I can't speak much more to it than that. I'm a history major, and this page brings me a little stress relief. Glad. Good. Love to hear that. Thank you so much. That's a big compliment. But yeah, so I think we're probably reaching the end of questions and things related to this. I enjoyed this. I think this was an important topic. I'm glad that you guys all were here with me. Like I said, we will do this again, hopefully. My plan is to do it again next Sunday at 3 p.m. I don't know yet what the topic will be, but it will be a fun one. I try to be enthusiastic about any topic that I'm going to deliver to you guys. So with that, I will let you all go and let you enjoy your what's left of your Sunday, either afternoon or evening, as the case may be, or night, if you're across the pond. And I will see you all next time. Bye-bye.